to talk about the incendiary title of this live stream, which is Bernie Sanders, Shut the Fuck Up. Okay, now to be truthful, part of that was to get you all to watch this live stream. I actually did say that to Bernie Sanders on Twitter because it had come to my attention that over the last 24 hours, he's tweeted about a half a dozen tweets on this Russia interference, the supposed Russia collusion, the Russian influencing people to vote for him. I mean, it is so outrageous to me that he has not only bought into this deep state propaganda, but he is now amplifying it for the deep state. I started Los Angeles for Bernie in May of 2015. But even prior to that, in October of 2014, I joined with PDA's effort to get Bernie to run. And when I went all the way up to Richmond to meet him at a fundraiser for the Richmond Progressive Alliance, my friends Gail McLaughlin and Jovanka Beckles, and I went there with one goal in mind, and that was to ask Bernie to run as an independent, not as a Democrat. And I said to him, Bernie, if you run as an independent, you can lead a movement, not just a campaign. And he said, thank you very much. I've heard that from several people. I will be considering it. So now when Bernie did not run as an independent and he ran as a Democrat, I understood his rationale. It was because he wanted to get into the debates. He wanted to be covered by the mainstream media. And at the time, that made a lot of sense to me. You know, the irony is that he did not get covered by the mainstream media. If you remember that famous statistic, ABC only gave him 13 seconds in all of 2016, or maybe that was 2015. And he was in the debates, but they cut down the number of debates to 6, even though there were like 22 of them in 2012. And they scheduled them on Saturday, opposite major football games, etc., etc. But still, Bernie Sanders managed to eke out almost 50% of the vote, won very many state primaries, even though we now know that he was sabotaged by Hillary Clinton, who was running the DNC well in advance of her clinching the nomination. And yet, this is not what he's calling out, okay? There were a lot of people during the election that renounced him for not calling out the Democratic primary fraud, for not calling out the DNC influence, and I even gave him a pass at the time. I understood what he was doing then, you know, and Jane even said in some article where she was quoted that it would be perceived as sour grapes. Like, I didn't win the election, so I'm blaming it on this or I'm blaming it on that. And he was trying, like he always does, to take the high road and be above the fray and just kind of focus on the issues. And I always appreciated that Bernie is focusing on the issues. But let's face it, folks, foreign policy is an issue. And it's a very important issue. And I have been saying since pretty much October of 2017, when I did a live stream about this, that fomenting a new Cold War with Russia is extremely dangerous. A Cold War could very easily turn into a hot war, and Russia has nuclear weapons. And now we have a very unstable president, Donald Trump, who has his hand on the button, or the red phone, or however he can launch a nuclear attack. And he is very susceptible to public opinion. He already launched that attack on the Syrian air base last year, even though I'm very doubtful that that was another chemical weapons attack by Assad. You know, the previous one in 2014 was proven to not be Assad. One thing we all knew about Bernie is that he didn't really have great foreign policy. You know, he didn't really call out the wars, except to say that he voted against the Iraq war. And he did actually one amazing foreign policy speech at Georgetown University, which did not get enough coverage in the mainstream media, big surprise. Bernie clearly shows that he intellectually understands the history of the deep state, because he talks about the CIA and how they overthrew Mossadegh, who was the democratically elected leader in Iran back in the 1950s, because Mossadegh wanted to do, wait for it, the horrible thing of nationalizing the oil company so that the Iranian oil could benefit the Iranian people. Imagine the concept, as opposed to benefiting BP, British Petroleum. So we overthrew Mossadegh. We installed the Shah of Iran, who actually became like a brutal dictator, even though it was supposed to be a democracy. He had his Savak, the secret police there, that were clamping down and torturing all sorts of dissidents. And that is why the Ayatollah Khomeini had the revolution back in 1979. That was what you call blowback for our interference. And there were a lot of people, young people I know, they relocated to America that were in support of that revolution because of how bad the Shah of Iran was. So now we have this situation with Muslim fundamentalism in that country. And of course we all know that we supported Saddam Hussein before we were against him when he was fighting Iran. And we also supported the Taliban when they were fighting Russia. So it's like all these people that are supposedly such horrible people, we can look back and show that we supported them. We also supported Gaddafi in Libya. Now, I kind of was not studying up on Libya, and I tended to believe what I read, that he was a brutal dictator, blah, blah, blah. See, this is what they always do. They did it with Assad, also in Syria. But I found out that Libya was actually the most advanced country on the African continent. They had the highest GDP, they had free health care, they had free education, and the real reason that we toppled Libya, Gaddafi, was that he was trying to go off the petrodollar, the US petrodollar, and start a pan-African currency backed by Libyan gold and silver. And that's why we overthrew him. We turned Libya into a failed state from which terrorists are training and entering Europe. And, you know, Hillary Clinton famously said, "We came, we saw, he died, ha ha ha," something like that. I don't remember the exact quote. She was gleeful about this. And then, you know, we did the same thing in the Ukraine. Like everybody's trying to say, oh, what Russia did in the Ukraine and Crimea shows how they interfere in other countries. Well, if you go to Consortium News, which is where I get a lot of my information, because the late Robert Parry, who recently died, was the editor of that. He was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He worked for AP in the 1980s that uncovered the Iran-Contra story. And like Chris Hedges, who was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, Robert Parry was outcast by the mainstream corporate media because he was questioning the deep state narrative of the time. He edits Consortium News, and he gave a lot of coverage to the Ukrainian situation. Apparently this neocon, Victoria Nuland, was, I don't know if she was actually part of Hillary Clinton's State Department or was just an advisor, but she was the one that orchestrated the regime change in the Ukraine. And what happened was we overthrew their democratically elected leader, the president there, because he was favorable to Russia. And we installed the current president, who is a neo-Nazi, by the way, simply because he is favorable to us. And here's the thing. Okay, I was a history major in college, and I wrote a paper on the revisionist theory of the Cold War. And we're going back like 4 decades now. But everything I said has been borne out. And if you watch The Untold History of the United States, or read the book that goes with it by Oliver Stone, it was on Showtime, you can see how the Cold War started. It was not because Russia was trying to take over the world and the whole domino theory. So Russia was our ally, part of the Allied forces in World War II. And Russia helped to defeat the Nazis. Okay, so Russia lost 25 million people. Their country was devastated. And we had promised, Roosevelt made promises at Yalta with Stalin, that we were going to help rebuild their country in the same way that we had the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. But Harry Truman broke all of those promises. Now, here's the thing about Harry Truman. He was an idiot. Was this dupe that they wanted to put in as vice president. Allen Dulles, who was head of the CIA, and his brother, John Foster Dulles, the deep state back then. So Henry Wallace, who was Roosevelt's vice president, in those days they elected the vice president separately, he was like the Bernie Sanders of his day. He was running for re-election for Roosevelt's 4th term, and he was winning. Now, he was even more of an isolationist and a peace activist than Bernie Sanders. So he was winning, and what happened was, you talk about shenanigans, someone pulled the fire alarm in the convention hall so that they could clear the convention hall out and strong-arm the delegates with their backroom, you know, machine politics that they did back in the day, to switch their vote to Henry Wallace. And sure enough, the next day, when the convention reconvened and they took a vote, Harry Truman won. So, had we had Henry Wallace as vice president and then president when Roosevelt died, things could have turned out a lot differently. But we didn't. We had Harry Truman, and he bought into the whole deep state thing and got us initially involved with Vietnam and started the Cold War. So Vietnam, you know, they tried to sell us on this whole domino theory, when in fact it was Ho Chi Minh was actually a freedom fighter trying to fight off the yoke of French colonialism. He came to the United States. He tried to meet with Roosevelt, but Roosevelt wouldn't meet with him. And he was a communist, but he was not a Soviet communist. So when he wasn't able to get any help from us, he did get help from the Soviets. But it was certainly not Soviet-instigated war. It was a civil war. And then, of course, we propped up the corrupt guy in South Vietnam, and we lost 50,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. And Nixon finally, you know, got out of that war after the anti-war movement. So I think Bernie knows about this history, but I don't really think that Bernie is particularly interested in foreign policy. He's more of a domestic policy guy, and it was one of the things that he was faulted for during his campaign. Now, it was one thing when he was not mentioning foreign policy, but it's a complete other thing when he is now amplifying this bullshit Russiagate narrative that Russia colluded with Trump to interfere in our elections. And he has made, like I said, half a dozen tweets in the last 24 hours. This indictment is more BS. This Mueller indictment for these this internet marketing company in Russia is a clickbait farm. All they're trying to do is get clicks for their sock puppets. Most of their fake ads had nothing to do with politics. And the ones that did have to do with politics, there were very few of them that were about Bernie Sanders. And there was a lot of issue-based ads, you know. So really the idea was not to interfere with the election. It was to get more clicks. Jill Stein did a Facebook Live yesterday in which she outlined this whole thing. And she brought the attention back to where it belonged, which is the interference by the Clinton campaign in our primaries, the interference by the Republican Party with their cross-check program, you know, disenfranchising many voters, mostly Democratic voters, which she tried to look into. And other people have commented, like I think it was Walter Bragman, who I had on my show. He's an independent journalist. He talked about the $181 billion worth of dark money that the Koch brothers, George Soros, and other billionaires have used to influence our election. And I would also, I've talked about the $5 billion that the corporate mainstream media gave to Trump. $5 billion worth of free advertising. So if they want to blame anyone for Trump being elected, they ought to blame themselves. And this was part of, you know, the WikiLeaks email that came out that talked about the Pied Piper strategy. Hillary Clinton actually wanted to elevate Trump as well as Ted Cruz because she thought they were such jokes that they couldn't possibly win. So, you know, why isn't the mainstream media talking about this? Or, You know, Mike Sinato also made a great tweet earlier today. He's another independent journalist who I had on my show. He talked about the clickbait farms of Occupy Democrats and Share Blue and Addicting Information and all those other clickbait organizations that are spreading the mainstream centrist narrative. Correct the record were the Hillary Clinton trolls. And the Hillary Clinton trolls actually took over entire Bernie Sanders pages. So why isn't the mainstream media talking about that? Last March, I had on Alita Pierce, who managed several Bernie Sanders pages, and she showed that they were doing a very good job. They identified these bots from Russia and from Macedonia and whatnot, and they were doing a very good job filtering them out. So, they didn't really get a lot of play, as much play as the mainstream media and Mueller's indictment would like us to believe. And furthermore, and this is the most important thing, people who were supporting Bernie Sanders were not supporting him because of anything they read on Facebook. They were supporting him because of his policies that he's had for 40 years and because they couldn't stand Hillary Clinton because of her policies. It's just amazing to me that these people think that we're so stupid and so gullible that we could be duped by these few Russian trolls that managed to get through a few of these Bernie Sanders memes on Facebook in face of all these other influences on the election. And even Obama, okay, was trying to get along with Russia prior to 2014 when we entered the Syrian civil war based on that fake allegation of Assad gassing his own people. So this is what they always do. Remember, Saddam gassed his own people, Libya gassed his own people, everybody's gassing their own people. And this is supposed to get us so appalled that we got involved. And the reason we didn't get involved was that we didn't know who to back over there because everybody was questionable. And we ended up backing the al-Nusra Front, which was an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda, okay? And we were calling them terrorists prior to us backing them, and then we started calling them moderate rebels. And the White Helmets, they are not what they pretended to be, okay? They are actually part of the al-Nusra Front, and they pretended to be this humanitarian organization that was pulling babies out of the rubble. Then they were shown to be actually killing people themselves because they were part of the opposition. We were funding them, and they were going in and out of Turkey, rearming themselves. They looked like they had these vans, and they were just bringing in humanitarian aid, but in reality, they were bringing in arms. Now, if we wanted to fund somebody, we would have funded the Syrian civil defense organization that the UN supported and that had been in existence for 50 years. But instead, we funded this White Helmets organization that was actually funded by a guy by the name of Ayman Asfari. He ran a group called Petrofrac, okay? Petrofrac, because the Syrian thing was all about oil and gas, just like it always is. The reason we wanted to get in there was that Qatar had a pipeline. They wanted to pump their Qatarian gas through Syria to Europe to counteract the Russian gas that was going from Russia through Turkey to Europe. Our CIA has been trying to achieve regime change in Syria for 50 years because Assad's father would not play along with U.S. business interests, okay? He was a nationalist like Mossadegh, who really wanted to control his own destiny. Imagine what a thought, right? Russia has a history of being attacked on its western borders, and why did we not dismantle NATO after the Cold War ended, right? NATO was set up to combat Russia. They got rid of their organization. We keep putting in more bases. They got rid of their bases, and they were trying to work with Obama to decommission some of the nuclear weapons, which is really the way we want to be going. But now, because we have a new Cold War that I contend is going to lead to a hot war, of course, Trump, to prove, this is how stupid they are. If they understood Trump, they would know that he does everything because of publicity and because of how he's perceived. And if he's being perceived as favorable to Russia, then he's going to do everything to prove that he's not, even though he's going to still try behind the scenes to keep his business interests going with them. So that's why he bombed the Syrian air base, and that's why he's talking about building more nuclear weapons. The last thing we need to be doing is building more nuclear weapons. We need to be decommissioning the nuclear weapons we have, and I think that Putin does understand that. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not a supporter of Trump, and I'm not a supporter of Putin. I believe that both of them are kleptocrats that are trying to bleed their countries dry, enrich themselves, using their office to enrich themselves and their business interests. And I think that's what Mueller should be going after. He should be going after the fact that they have all these business interests, and maybe that's where this line with Manafort is going. If it can prove that he's working with the government of Russia, then we can impeach Trump on the emoluments clause. And also this obstruction of justice. So all of these are very good lines to be pursuing. But this very first indictment, the 13 people, and half of these, by the way, half of these Facebook ads were done after the 2016 election. And as I've already shown you, most of them had nothing to do with politics. Very few of them had to do with Bernie Sanders, and our Bernie Sanders administrators were very good at identifying them and making sure that they did not get any exposure on the page, and even if they did, they were not influencing people to vote for Bernie Sanders. So again, for Bernie Sanders to be repeating this BS is atrocious in my opinion, and he should shut the fuck up. All right, so...